Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Van Sickle Robbins, City Club President, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, October 1st for today's forum. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, would everyone in the room please silence your cell phones now? Today we will hear from the two candidates for Metro Council President, Tom Hughes and Bob Stacey. But first, some announcements. I'd like to start by recognizing our new City Club members, Amanda Kalenbach and Brianne Carpenter, and any other new members who are here with us for the first time, or Friday Forum attendees who haven't been with us for a while. If you'll all please stand up, we'd like to welcome you. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support makes these City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to our fall season sponsors, AARP Oregon, the law firm of Barron Liebman, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and PGE. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. I'd like to also thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this in partnership with us today. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Today's moderator is Paul Gronke. He has been chair of the Political Science Department at Reed College since 2001, and he teaches courses on political behavior, political institutions, and social science research methods. He studies American politics and empirical political theory, and his specialties are the U.S. Congress, elections, and electoral behavior. Paul?
Thank you, Sharon. Thankfully, I'm no longer chair of the department, so that responsibility can go to someone else. Thanks to Sharon, to Marge Kafori, and Amy Harris for allowing me the privilege to moderate today's debate for Metro Council President candidates Tom Hughes and Bob Stacey. We know that many of you have attended these debates in the past, but for the new members and for the listeners, the debate format. The debate will have several sections. First, each debater will give a 3-minute opening statement. Following the opening statement, the debaters will respond to questions that were written in advance by City Club's Friday Forum Committee and City Club staff. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. We will rely on the judgment of our distinguished panel of City Club members sitting at the table in front of me and next to me to my right to decide on whether the debaters have indeed answered the moderator's questions. If 2 or more of these members raise their cards with a question on them, it indicates that these members believe the moderator's question, my question, has not been sufficiently answered. The question will then be restated and we'll ask the debater to reply once more. On today's panel, we'd like to thank Joyce DeMonin, Jean Hart, and Jennifer Rollins. Keeping time at our debate today is Tony Iaccarino. Following the City Club's questions, each debater will have the opportunity to ask 2 or, time permitting, 3 questions of the other. After this rotation, the debaters will make their 3-minute closing statements. Please be respectful of the debaters and please hold all applause during the debate. And now can you give And now the debaters. First, we have Tom Hughes. City Club is very pleased to welcome Tom Hughes. Tom was initially elected to public office in 1976 when he won a spot in the Hillsboro City Council, a position he held for 24 years. In 2001, Tom was elected mayor of Hillsboro. During his first term, he served on 2 Metro Policy Advisory Committees focusing on land use and transportation. Mr. Hughes won re-election to a second term in 2005, during which he focused on recruiting companies to Oregon, including SolarWorld and Intel's development facility. He currently serves as an appointee to the Governor's Green Jobs Council. City Club is also pleased to welcome Bob Stacey. Bob served for 3 years as the Executive Director for Policy and Planning at the Tri-County Metropolitan Transportation District of Oregon, which focused on light rail development in the metro region. In his next position as Chief of Staff to Congressman Earl Blumenauer, Bob worked with federal agencies to improve their environmental and community impact. Bob's most recent position, where he served for 7 years, was as Executive Director of the land conservation nonprofit 1,000 Friends of Oregon. Now, as I step down and manage my own notes better, let's welcome our debaters, Tom Hughes and Bob Stacey. Mr. Hughes, if you will begin with your opening statement for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank the City Club for this opportunity and everybody who came today to listen to this fairly important debate, and particularly those of you who are listening out on OPB radio. And my opponent and I agree on most issues. We agree that the urban growth boundary is vitally important and must be preserved. We both agree that the region needs jobs. We both agree that transportation investment is critical to reduce greenhouse gases and decrease congestion. The biggest difference between us is our levels of experience. With 15 years of Planning Commission and 8 years as Mayor of Hillsboro, my experience is what the region needs now for Metro President, especially in 3 key areas. First, I have recruited businesses to Oregon and helped local businesses grow to create thousands of jobs in our community. Second, I have successfully managed a government of similar size and budget to Metro. And third, my experience in working with our region's local governments would help Metro build the trust that is necessary to get things done around the region. First, jobs. Metro's decisions on land use, transportation, and the regulatory environment have a tremendous impact on our ability to create jobs and keep them here. Today, you will hear both of us talk about creating jobs. The difference is I've actually done it. While I was Mayor of Hillsboro, we recruited and built a huge job base. As mayor, I recruited businesses like SolarWorld and Genetech that created thousands of jobs. I helped mature our entrepreneurs and small businesses. We worked the whole supply chain. This experience is the reason that I've been endorsed by 5 chambers of commerce and many small business organizations. As Metro President, I will be an ambassador for the entire region to create jobs in all 3 counties so people can work near where they live, and we need this now. A second major difference is management experience. I'm the only one of the 2 of us who has actually served in elective office, managed a similar budget, or served on and led a council. As Mayor of Hillsboro, the 5th largest city in the state, I managed a workforce and a budget about the same size as Metro. I was head of a council and helped lead them to consensus. I had a diverse list of duties: parks, economic development, arts and culture, similar to the role the Metro President plays. This experience is why I'm endorsed by the union that represents Metro staff, the people who know Metro best. But the most important difference is my experience in working collaboratively with the local government leaders around the region to find solutions to issues like land use and economic development. Metro must coordinate 25 cities and 3 counties. I have built relationships that can help Metro avoid squabbles, build consensus, and work together to create a prosperous region that preserves our quality of life. And that's why 14 of the region's mayors have endorsed me. As a teacher, as a mayor, I've created jobs, and I can do that as Metro President. Thank you for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Stacey, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon. For 30 years, Metro has played a critical role in protecting farmland, forest land, and water quality while strengthening our towns and neighborhoods. Metro's urban growth boundary and other policies have contributed greatly to our region's quality of life. Today, with the official unemployment rate at 10.5%, we're forcefully reminded that quality of life begins with a job. Metro must also focus on preparing our region for economic recovery. But in working for economic recovery, we don't need to sacrifice our long-term quality of life: healthy neighborhoods, farmland, forest land, air and water quality. We must ensure that economic revitalization goes hand in hand with environmental quality. We can build for jobs inside our communities, close to where people who are looking for work already live, where we've already invested in most of the infrastructure needed to support these job sites, instead of expanding the urban growth boundary onto more farmland because we didn't make our existing vacant land shovel-ready. We should get to work on the thousands of acres of vacant land zoned for jobs in our communities right next door. Metro's technical assistance and transportation resources can help local governments remove barriers to employers that prevent them from using that land, barriers like a length of pipe or street that's incomplete, a large site that's divided into small, separately owned parcels and lots, an old oil tank, or other soil contamination. Solving these problems will increase the supply of shovel-ready sites in our communities, saving farmland and open space, reducing trip lengths, energy consumption, and pollution. I know we can do this because this is the kind of work I've been doing for the 35 years of my career, in private practice, public interest work, and in governmental service at the local, regional, state, and federal levels. I know how to prepare sites and build for jobs because I've done that in the private sector. I know how to plan, fund, and build major transportation projects because I've done that. And I know how to protect farmland and open space by holding the line on the urban growth boundary because I've done that too. That's why I'm the only candidate in this race endorsed by the Oregon League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club, by former governors Atiyeh, Roberts, and Kitzhaber, and by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, as well as thoughtful developers who understand how important good planning is to great communities. I ask for your support as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stacey. We'll now move to the portion of the program where questions will be asked that were prepared by the Friday Forum Committee and by City Club staff. I remind you that the debaters have not seen these questions in advance. All questions will be directed to both debaters, each of whom have 60 seconds to respond. We encourage the debaters to use their time not only to offer their response, but to rebut their opponent's statement. Our first question is for you, Mr. Hughes. Outgoing Metro President David Bragdon often started his presentations by joking, "We don't run the buses, and I'm not here from TriMet." This was a reference to the common confusion among the public about Metro's role in the region. But Metro Auditor Suzanne Flynn recently reported that over the last 3 years, Metro spent $13.2 million on communications and public engagement. With Metro spending more than $4 million a year on communications and engagement with the public, why is it that so many people don't know what Metro does?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to understand that in Oregon, as in many other parts of the country, there is a general lack of understanding about government in general. Recent polls would indicate that about 30% of the population, for example, don't know that we have 2 senators. And so not knowing what Metro does is probably not a big surprise. I think that, that communicating with the public about the important roles that Metro plays is key to going forward as an organization, however. They've been successful at getting bond measures. They've been successful at getting getting the communities to cooperate together. But I think that it needs to be more visible and more vocal. Perhaps the idea is to elect a teacher as Metro president and to use the skills that I honed in 30 years of dealing with classrooms to carry that message to the general public.
Thank you. Mr. Stacey, your response?
It is appalling how many citizens know very little about Metro, despite the important decisions that it makes, particularly in light of the level of expenditure on communication and on outreach. I think the emphasis in Metro's program has been more on communicating what Metro is doing and providing opportunities for people to come down to Grand Avenue for a public hearing on what they propose to do than going to where people live, work, and worship and engaging citizens in the work and decisions that Metro needs to make. It will be much more likely that people understand Metro's work if they're helping Metro do that work and make those decisions in the way that Metro's plan adopted for the region in the mid-1990s engaged directly the participation of 19,000 people. We can do that again by more prudently spending those dollars.
Thank you, Mr. Stacey. Now I have a question for Mr. Stacey and a slightly different follow-up for Mr. Hughes. In his campaign, Mr. Hughes touts his economic prowess and business credentials. In his campaign, Mr. Stacey emphasizes his environmental credentials. Mr. Hughes has been endorsed, as we've already heard, by the Oregon Business Association. Mr. Stacey told us about his endorsement by the Oregon League of Conservation Voters. You each clearly have a natural constituency, but Metro encompasses many communities with many distinct and at times conflicting interests over the environment, over the economy and economic development, and over transportation. Mr. Stacey, why should someone who's strongly pro-business vote for you?
Because business prospers when the entire region prospers. Business prospers when we make efficient use of the tax dollars we've already spent, and we apply ourselves to making the land that we have in our urban growth boundary in our communities ready for jobs, rather than overcommitting the taxpayer and the private sector by trying to extend development unnecessarily out into the fields and forests around our region, committing ourselves, private dollars and public dollars necessary to build not only the missing piece of infrastructure, but all the pipes, all the schools, all the parks, the fire stations, and everything else necessary to support urban development. That's not a sound business practice. That's a wasteful practice, and it will hinder our region's economic competitiveness, which comes from the compact growth form and efficient transportation system we're building.
Mr. Hughes, why should someone deeply concerned about the environment vote for you?
I would say, first of all, that they would probably vote for me for the same reasons that the Oregon League of Conservation Voters endorsed me as mayor the first, both terms that I ran. And that's because of 15 years on the Planning Commission and also the 8 years as mayor out in Hillsboro, we developed a community that did two things with passion. One was create jobs in our community, which we did as effectively as any community around, but also to do that in a way that protected the environment. If you want to talk about efficient use of land, we have 1,700 acres in Hillsboro that's our industrial core that produces about $2 billion worth of wages and salaries each year as direct wages and salaries. That's a pretty efficient use of land. We've had marginal expansions over the years, particularly the years that I've been involved in urban growth boundary expansion, and in fact, I was elected mayor the first time to oppose expansion, and that expansion still hasn't taken place.
Do we have two questions or one?
Two.
Mr. Hughes, the environmentalist, asks again, why should they vote for you?
Because I have a great record on the environment, as I just indicated. I led a city that is really a model for how to build jobs and still keep faith with environmental activism. I have a strong commitment to maintaining the urban growth boundary, and I've said that over and over again in every forum that I have appeared. I have a strong commitment to restoring habitat. I come from a city where we've spent thousands and thousands of dollars restoring the Jackson Bottom wetland, for example, in the southern part of town, to provide an education center for children on the importance of environmental values. So I've had a commitment, a lifelong commitment, as both an educator and a local government official to environmental issues.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes, this question is for you. Metro is perhaps best known for land use and for transportation planning. Metro also oversees well-known community assets like the Oregon Zoo and several regional parks. But the Council does not often directly address one of Oregon's broadest and most pervasive concerns, job creation. What role, if any, do you think Metro should play in regional economic development?
Well, there's two things that Metro should do, in my view. One that they're currently not doing, and that is that every time we have raised economic development issues as part of the Metro policy-making process, they've responded by saying they don't have economic development responsibility. They control land use planning, they control the regulatory environment, they control transportation investment and planning, they control the urban growth boundary, which sets the land supply. They have a key role to play in economic development. They need to appreciate that, they need to understand that, they need to basically make that a part of their planning process. The other thing they have is an amazing opportunity to bring together the region around the regional table to collaborate on issues. They need to do that more effectively around the issue of economic development. And because I have good communication, good contacts with those folks who are doing that now, I'm more likely to be able to bring that discussion to bear.
Mr. Stacey, your rebuttal and response.
Metro can and should be a participant, not necessarily a convener because people have already convened, but a participant in ongoing efforts by the public sector and the private sector to develop a coordinated and thoughtful regional economic development strategy. Metro has tools to bring to that table, and it should be cognizant of and participating in the development of a strategy that helps pick traded sector leaders that this region might pursue and the strategies necessary to do that. But Metro also needs to stick to its knitting, which is its land use and transportation responsibilities, and use its planning dollars, its grants to local governments, its infrastructure resources to help fill the gaps that local governments face in trying to make land ready so that we can make efficient use of the urban form we're creating.
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Stacey. Oregon's land use laws tightly control the available land supply, but Oregon's economic growth industries, such as high-tech manufacturing and the apparel trade, claim that the remaining industrial land that is inside the urban growth boundary is too small, too close to residential areas, and is contaminated or otherwise unsuitable for use. They believe that land outside the boundary is available for prime industrial development, flat, near transportation, and inexpensive, yet it is all reserved for farming. Do you believe that the strict land use policies are hurting the economic development in our region?
I believe the smart land use policies that our region employs, guided by state land use laws that have helped protect and strengthen Oregon for the last 35 years, are encouraging and enabling our economy to be stronger than it otherwise would be. We do have sites, large sites inside the urban growth boundary. The question of whether there are enough large sites that are prepared and of sufficient size for campus-style industries that require those kinds of sites comes up every 5 years. The Chief Operating Officer of Metro has recommended to the Council that this fall, Metro expand the urban growth boundary by about 300 acres to provide additional sites for just those kinds of uses, but not for general industrial, because we need to clean up those sites that your question complains of that are dirty. We need to make sure that they're ready for all the supply chain firms, all the businesses that are already here and seeking to expand. So we can't just go on to farmland, and we shouldn't.
Mr. Hughes?
Well, as someone who's been out, it's just taking trips out of Oregon, recruiting companies to come to Oregon, I can tell you that the quality of life that we've established in this state is very definitely a selling point to businesses who want to relocate. And I would use the example of Genetech that allegedly had substantially better financial offer from the city of Dallas, Texas to move there and came to Hillsboro instead, in part because of the quality of life. So in that particular case, our land use laws actually were valued at about $50 million in additional incentives that we didn't have to give in order to recruit a company here. For the most part, I think a wise application of those land use laws is supported by most of the business community that I've talked to, at least. And I also support Michael Jordan, the COO's report, that we need additional lots. We need a small number of additional lots. But I think the important part about Michael's report is the idea of creating a process by which when we use a large site, we get another one restored.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. This question is for Mr. Hughes. For better or for worse, Metro constitutes an additional layer of government that most regions do not possess. Being specific as you can, would you reduce or expand Metro's authority in particular areas, and why?
First of all, I think it's a misconcept that a lot of us have that Metro is a layer of government that other regions don't have. Most other regions around the country have some level of regional government, some level of regional coordination. Metro simply is the only one that has an elected body that represents it. I think that Metro has to pay more attention clearly as they go forward with their policymaking and regulatory activities to make sure that those regulations that they impose, I would prefer not to impose regulations, but rather to look at standards that local governments can meet and always push the regulatory part down to the local governments to say, do what you need to do in your community to achieve the goals that as a region we agree collectively we ought to achieve. So I think the old saw that the layer of government that governs closest to the people governs best is true even in regional government, and local governments is that layer.
Mr. Hughes, specifically, please, any areas of Metro currently that you would either expand or reduce their authority, and why?
Well, again, I think that it's a difficult question to answer specifically, in part because I don't think there are any specific regulations currently that are creating problems. I think when Metro, though, says we need to protect industrial land, for example, and imposes restrictions on the use of industrial land on local governments, they interfere with the local government's ability to regulate through their own zoning laws. And that what they should do instead is have an overall target of non-conversion and basically let the local governments reach that. So in the area of industrial land, on the area of habitat protection, I would be somewhat less restrictive than Metro has shown itself to be in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Stacey, specifically, in what areas would you reduce or expand Metro's authority, and why?
I don't think expansion of Metro's authority, if one means regulation, is what's needed at present. But Metro's ability to solve problems, particularly in areas that it already has some responsibility for, may need to be strengthened. Any such strengthening, if it goes beyond the current charter of Metro, would require voter approval and voter approval of any funding resources that would be needed. But look at two current examples. Metro has now 10,000 acres of parks and open space under its ownership and management. Metro does not have a solid plan and strategy for ensuring the long-term management and restoration of those lands so that they can truly be great public assets. It may become necessary for this community as a whole to develop such a strategy and to help pay for those needs, and Metro is a logical potential provider.
Mr. Stacey, I live in Southeast Portland. I run, I bike, and I drive across the Selwood Bridge many times a week. And like many of us, I get worried every time. Multnomah County and the city of Portland appear to be at an impasse over funding to replace the Selwood Bridge. This comes as no surprise given that Multnomah County owns many Willamette River bridges, but that the residents from all across the region use the bridges. Do we need a regional bridge authority to more equitably share responsibility for maintenance and funding of these bridges? And if so, what role should Metro play in it?
Paul, I do all those things in Southeast Portland as well, but I hardly call what I do running anymore. Metro should never let a situation like the Selwood Bridge emerge again. I think the role of the president, if this controversy is still festering between Mayor Adams and the county chair, that I would need to step in and visit about how we can resolve it and get the deal put back together. Because it's important that we not have a bridge fall down and endanger people's lives because of government inaction. How did we get here? The state of Oregon and this region failed to invest in a timely way in strategies to maintain that bridge, relying instead on a cash-strapped county that transfers most of its transportation dollars to the city of Portland as part of a long-term reallocation of responsibility. That was a failure of leadership at the state level. It was a failure at the regional level. We should never see that kind of failure again.
I agree. Mr. Stacey, specifically, do you support or oppose a regional bridge authority that would more equitably share responsibility for these bridges? And if so, what role should Metro play in such an authority?
No, I do not support the creation of a regional bridge authority. I believe the Selwood Bridge problem and the maintenance and management of other bridges in this region can and should continue to be the responsibility of individual transportation providers, and that Metro should continue to play the role of funding and policy direction, not operations.
Thank you.
Sorry for misunderstanding the question.
No, that's fine. Mr. Hughes, your response and rebuttal, please.
Well, once again, I think Bob and I agree on that. I don't believe we need a bridge authority. What we do need, however, is a region-wide discussion about key transportation places like the Selwood Bridge, like the other bridges across the Willamette, and other bridges around the region, to talk about how we would go about funding improvement of those bridges collaboratively as a region. We know that that's a regional facility. It ought to have some regional responsibility for solving the problem. I had to come from Lake Oswego to downtown Portland the other day, and I made a wrong turn and crossed the Selwood Bridge. Then I had to turn around and come back across it. I thought that 2 crossings in 5 minutes was probably rolling the dice more than I really wanted to. So I'm sensitive to the idea that bridge has loomed large, but there are other bridges, there are other transportation facilities that are going to need just as much attention, and I think a region-wide discussion, but not create a separate government.
Mr. Hughes, although Forest Park is owned and maintained by the City of Portland, it is undoubtedly a regional asset frequented by users throughout the region and from our visitors beyond. According to a recent City Club research report, current funding for the park falls far short of the amount needed to maintain its ecological health. This could be solved, the report notes, by creating a funding source dedicated to maintaining regionally significant parks and natural areas, including Forest Park. Do you believe that regional parks need a regional funding system? And if so, what role should Metro play in the development and management of such a system?
Well, I agree that there needs to be some sort of a mechanism by which we take care of valuable resources like Forest Park, whether that's and that may require regional funding. Whether we need a separate source or not, I'm not sure. I think that question needs to be answered again in a discussion with all of our local partners. I look at a number of other parks around the region that are maintained by the local governments that have regional significance, and I think, among other things, that the intertwined process that we're engaged in right now in discussing how to put those parks together, how to maintain them, how to develop them, is a good discussion that will ultimately lead to both funding sources and just general management opportunities.
Mr. Stacey, your rebuttal and response, please.
I spoke to this issue in response to an earlier question, but let me add that I agree with Tom that the intertwine, a cooperative effort begun by Metro, other parks providers and owners, the nonprofit organizations around our region who do care for, literally, physically care for these park facilities through volunteer efforts. This intertwined cooperative of governments and nonprofit groups is looking for solutions to the growing liability that the region faces in terms of under-maintained and under-protected natural resources. The ivy that invades Forest Park, illegal trail building, the deterioration of those places is a regional problem. I don't know either whether we have to have a regional funding source or simply an agreed upon strategy for individual park providers to develop those needs.
This question is for Mr. Stacey. According to the Metro website, the 2040 Growth Concept Plan calls for population growth to be concentrated in regional and town centers that include high-density housing within walking distance of transit, retail areas, and medical facilities. But cities like Gresham have arguably taken on more of their share of compact multifamily housing in the last 15 years since the plan was implemented, and residents complain that walkable, self-contained neighborhoods promised have not materialized. Are some cities in the region more negatively affected by the 2040 plan than others? And if so, what would you do as Metro President to address this concern?
It's important for us all to remember that in developing the implementation of the 2040 plan, the growth of town centers and main streets, Metro has over the last 15 years worked with local governments to help the local governments identify what they want to do to hit population, housing, and job targets, and how they want to array their future growth. So communities have chosen where the boundaries of regional centers and town centers precisely should be located. Communities have chosen what kind of zoning mixes and densities to apply to city main streets and downtowns and other centers. So of course, adjustment may be necessary, and if so, it's desirable, and Metro should not be a barrier to that. The goal here is to create great places, not to pack people in. And if people believe that they've reached a tipping point, that's a legitimate question for discussion.
Mr. Stacey.
Tough questions today.
It's a hard one. Could you name just a couple cities or areas that have been negatively affected by the 2040 plan? And if so, what you would do to address their concerns?
Well, Paul, no, I can't, frankly. The Rockwood area in Gresham is negatively affected by low-rent housing that's been poorly maintained in the past by its owners. That's not a consequence of the 2040 plan. The downtown of Lake Oswego has an area called Foothills, which until fairly recently was dominated by wood chip piles and a sewage treatment plant. The city of Lake Oswego wants to put housing and jobs into the Foothills district. Downtown Beaverton, some people think it's blighted by lots of parking lots and busy streets. Denny Doyle, the mayor of downtown Beaverton, helped create an urban renewal district and is trying to make a downtown, just like the 2040 plan says, in downtown Beaverton. I don't think the 2040 plan is causing problems. I think it's a path to solutions.
Mr. Hughes, your rebuttal and response, please.
Well, again, I think I agree with Bob. And as 15 years on the Planning Commission and 8 years as mayor of actually working with the 2040 plan, so for my community and for my experience, it's not just a theory. It's how do you actually apply that theory on the ground to developments. And I think that one of the things that Hillsboro has done very effectively is to design the station areas in a way that increases the density, but doesn't necessarily increase the problems. Now, that's not universally true throughout even a city like Hillsboro, and I think Bob is correct that if you talk about a city as large as Gresham, for example, there are things that have been beneficial about the plan and things that have not, at least problems that have not been solved by the plan. In the case of Hillsboro, the same would be true. We have station areas where there is probably problems created by density, but we have places like Orenco Station that have become showcases for the rest of the country. So.
I'd like to thank both of you for staying within your time. During this portion of the program, each debater will ask questions of the other. We have time for 3 questions from each debater. Debaters must ask their questions within 30 seconds. The opposing debater will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner will have the option of a 30-second rebuttal. We will alternate between the debaters, and we will begin. Excuse me. We will begin with Mr. Name that's not here. We will begin with Mr. Hughes.
So I get to ask the first question?
Yes, sir.
One of the things, Bob, you and I have now, I think this is either our 35th or 36th joint appearance, and so quite frankly, there's very little about you anymore that I don't know. But one of the showcase responsibilities of Metro is running the zoo. A Metro president has to have great involvement in the zoo. So I guess my question for you is, what's your favorite zoo animal?
Your response
Tom, there you go. Now my question number 2 to you is spoiled.
You can ask it, because I have a different answer probably.
Tom, I'm a sucker for the giraffe. It's a remarkable animal, and it looks at home in its enclosure, although it could be larger. It's magnificent, it's spotted, and it's willing to stick its neck out, Tom.
Mr. Hughes, I assume you have a response.
Well, yeah, I think my favorite animal would have to be actually a little more specific than that, in that I'm very fond of mojito. And for any of you who have ever had an opportunity to go behind the scene at the penguin enclosure, Mojito is the friendliest little humble penguin anybody ever saw. He loves people, actually, among other things, and he's really quite a character. So in my opportunity to go up and do some tours of the zoo as part of preparing me for this job, I've gotten to know Mojito pretty well, and I like him a lot. So.
Gentlemen, this is a debate after all. Mr. Stacey,
Well, I'd like
your
to
first question of Mr. Hughes.
I'm going to stay on this high plane of policy. I'll skip over the part where I ask you what your favorite animal is, Tom, and note that, I came to this question because you asked me when we were here in the spring who my favorite teacher was, and I figured it would be self-serving to ask who your favorite transportation and land use policy leader is. But skipping over Mojito, how do you think Mojito will fare under the zoo bond levy?
I think Mojito and a lot of his colleagues up at the zoo will fare very well under that proposal. The $125 million that we're going to spend over the next, I believe it's 15 years, to upgrade facilities both at the zoo and in the case of the elephants off-site, so that elephants can actually have some time to be elephants, which I understand they enjoy. Which I can understand. And so I think that that's going to go very well. I think it is a good thing that the Metro Auditor raised issues about how the zoo had been functioning in the past, and that those issues got corrected. I really feel comfortable that they can go forward with a really solid construction plan. And again, I look forward to supervising from the Metro presidency a similar role that I had as Mayor of Hillsboro, where I also helped to supervise large construction projects like the Civic Center and the library and some of those projects. So I think I bring that experience to the job to help see to it that zoo bond gets correctly applied.
Mr. Stacey, 30-second rebuttal.
Very briefly, this is not a rebuttal. I agree that the animal welfare objectives served by the bond measure that the people voted for in 2008 are worthy of our world-class zoo and will help keep it in the forefront of both animal care and habitat for the folks, the animals that are housed there. I also agree with Tom that it's critically important for the Metro Council to ensure that we don't have another critical audit of the zoo bond expenditures and undertakings, and that we do the best possible job as a council of maintaining oversight of those construction projects, which, by the way, had their first groundbreaking on Wednesday.
Mr. Stacey, your next question. Excuse me, Mr. Hughes, your next question of Mr. Stacey.
Well, we haven't actually had an opportunity today to talk much about the infamous about the CRC project. And I'm curious because in the initial forum that we attended, the Ask Me forum back in January, you were pretty adamant that spending billions of dollars on a big highway and bridge project that take our community in the wrong direction was something you were not going to allow. That was on January 19th. But as recently as the Willamette Week article, you said we both support getting the bridge built. So I guess my question for you today is, where are you on the bridge, and do you support the preferred option that has gained some consensus around the region?
Mr. Stacey.
I don't support the preferred option, which in English language is a 10-lane bridge rather than a 12-lane bridge connecting to a 6-lane freeway in Oregon. I do support a project that will make the transportation problems that commuters face at the bridge every morning better. I do support a project that will reduce the amount of traffic in neighborhoods on both sides of the river. I do support a project that will reduce greenhouse gases and air pollution, and a project we can afford. I think we need to start with some of the good advice from the governor's independent review panel, which identified the fact that there is no certainty to the finance plan for this project, that the project has untested elements, including the bridge design, and that the community needs to have a phasing strategy to ensure that we deliver the project we need, given the resources that the legislatures and Congress are able to provide.
Mr. Hughes, you have the option of a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, I guess I would just say in passing that that 3 years of study by a fairly high-quality blue ribbon panel and $100 million in planning money answered, from my perspective, answered many of the questions that we've talked about. How do we reduce congestion? How do we reduce greenhouse gases? How do we make the bridge safer? was answered by that panel in the preferred option. We have probably a year and a half, 2 years to push that project forward. I think we need to get behind it and begin to move it. We have time to look at the other responses.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Stacey, your next question of Mr. Hughes.
Tom, during this campaign, you've told Washington County business audiences that you supported urban reserves 3 times larger than those adopted by Metro and Washington County, about 43,000 acres instead of 13, and that you hope the entire 50-year land supply that these urban reserves represent, quote, isn't enough land for our economic recovery. Individuals and firms with a direct economic interest in urban growth boundary expansion have donated more than $100,000 to your campaign. How do you plan to respond to those donors if you're elected?
Mr. Hughes.
Well, first of all, I'm always a little leery about the way you characterize my supporters. My supporters actually include a wide range of business interests from all around the region, including many donors who have interests in downtown Portland who would object to expanding the urban growth boundary. Second of all, my position on the expansion of the urban growth boundary has been pretty apparent over 8 years of running the city of Hillsboro, and it has been a modest expansion of the urban growth boundary. We had numbers that could justify additional expansion. We didn't get that proposal. We are now going to live within the guidelines that have been set by the Metro, which was just actually recommended by DLCD staff that they approve that urban reserve, rural reserve process. I am a strong advocate of a very tightly held, very wisely parceled urban growth boundary expansion, and virtually everyone who has given me money knows that and has given me money with that in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Stacey, 30 seconds for a response and rebuttal.
I think it is important for us to be cognizant of the interests that our contributors may seek. I'm proud that I have 1,500 individual and business contributors from around the region supporting my campaign, and that my major donors don't have an economic interest in urban growth boundary expansion, but are motivated by their concern about public policy, environmental protection, and smart urban development. So I'm concerned about what this means for our region.
Mr. Hughes, your next question of Mr. Stacey.
Yeah, while we're on the issue of funders, my funding sources my top 10 funding sources, which include labor unions, some of whom, by the way, are here to support me today, business groups, and individuals, speak with a chorus of policy requests. Those top 10 contributors have given me around $77,000. Your top contributor has given you $78,000 and speaks clearly with one voice, and he has an agenda which he is pushing forward. How do you account for that?
Mr. Stacey, your response, please.
My top contributor is a vintner, is an advocate for agricultural land protection, is a philanthropist, is a member of the Governor's Global Warming Commission, fiercely believes that we need to do something about climate change that's facing our planet, and believes, as I do, that compact urban development, protection of farms and forest land, and making a transportation system that gives us more choices in how we get around so that we don't always have to get in the car and we don't always have to drive across a large region, helps us move in the direction of climate stability. I share the views, and I'm very proud of that donor's support, and it's very clear that I'm signaling my intentions to act in a way that will protect our natural resources and give us more transportation choices, and I'll help lead the fight against global warming.
Mr. Hughes, you have the option of a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, I think that when we get into the issue of talking about what influence money has on political campaigns, which is a topic I used to discuss with my government classes over and over again, I think that when you have a group of supporters who don't speak with one voice, you have a wide range of responses to their wishes. When you have a contributor one contributor, regardless of how worthy that contributor is, they speak with one voice, and they have to have that kind of influence.
Thank you. I think we have one last. Mr. Stacey, your question of Mr. Hughes.
Tom, in the 8 years you were mayor of Hillsboro, that city had running battles with Metro. opposing metro policies designed to protect farmland from sprawl and to conserve important job sites inside the urban growth boundary for industry instead of shopping malls. Hillsboro sued Metro and lost at one point, and your city asked the 2005 legislature to limit Metro's planning authority. Do you plan to take further steps, if elected, to limit Metro's authority?
Mr. Hughes.
It's interesting because the 8 years that I was mayor, I learned a lot about collaboration. We did have ongoing discussions with Metro, disputes with Metro. One of the things I learned about collaboration is that conflict is not always bad. It clarifies where you are. In '05, for example, we went into the legislature with a bill that would have limited Metro's ability to direct local government on specific zone changes, and we were not successful with that. We had a fairly nasty battle with them. We came out of that battle and said, you know, we didn't really like that very well. That didn't feel very good. My staff gathered together. I think David Bragdon and I have shared this story, and he has said that his staff got together. And in the '07 legislature, we went into the legislature together and came out with the proposal for Senate Bill 1011, which gave us urban reserves and rural reserves. What we discovered collectively and collaboratively is that collectively and collaboratively we can accomplish a lot more than we could by conflict, but we had to have the conflict first.
Mr. Stacey, your rebuttal.
Well, Tom put it well. Conflict sometimes clarifies where you are. And in this case, where Tom is a supporter of regular expansion of the urban growth boundary, of setting urban reserves that are larger than the regional consensus indicated was needed by about 3 times, and by assuring listeners that he supports the rapid use of those urban reserves to aid economic recovery. I want to see us conserve the reserves for the long run, not use them immediately.
Thank you, gentlemen. It appears we do have some differences between these two fine candidates beyond their favorite animal. We'll now move to the final portion of the program, 3-minute closing statements from each debater, and we will begin with Mr. Hughes.
Well, thank you again to the City Club for organizing this. This is always a highlight of every political campaign, and I'm pleased to have been a part of it today. Hopefully we have, between the two of us, we have managed to bring some light to this really important and I think sometimes complicated race. I would go back again and say that the reason that I'm asking for your support is that I believe that I'm the best candidate because my experience has taught me, has been in 3 basic areas. I am the candidate who has worked with businesses to help expand jobs in the region. I can do that at the regional level as I did it as Mayor of Hillsboro. I am the candidate that's had management experience in a very similar kind of a situation to the Metro president. Same size organization, same size budget, similar kinds of responsibilities, similar kinds of platform. And thirdly, that I am the guy that has the endorsement of 14 of the mayors around the region because they know that I work collaboratively, because they trust me to be able to bring that level of collaboration to the Metro chair. Bob and I agree on more things, I think, sometimes than Bob's willing to admit. One of those things that we agree on is the importance of holding tight the urban growth boundary. In fact, if you think about it, the Metro president will have two chances to look at expansion possibilities of the urban growth boundary, and Bob and I are virtually in agreement with Michael Jordan, the COO, about the first of those expansions, which is coming up later this year. We have never had an urban growth boundary expansion in this region that has gone beyond what the numbers indicate we need just to keep land prices at a relatively affordable price and just to be able to provide jobs for people in the community. I cannot anticipate any circumstances under which we're going to deviate from that in the second opportunity that we have to look at urban growth boundary expansion. So the difference between Bob and I is a difference without a distinction. And quite frankly, we both are supporters of the 2040. The difference, if you would, about our support for 2040 land use planning policies is that I'm the guy that spent 23 years actually putting them into effect. working on a downtown restoration, working on changing a town center at Amber Glen Tannisbourne to a regional center, working on developing the station areas as part of my job as a planning commissioner. Those are real accomplishments that I've had in my background that I can point to and say, look, you don't have to wonder what I will do. You know what I will do because you've seen what I've done in Hillsboro. I can do the same thing. I ask for your support for Metro President and look at my website, votetomhughes.com.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Stacey, 3 minutes, please.
My opponent and I both understand that Metro is only one of many actors in leading our region and state to economic recovery. We understand that Metro has no direct role in business recruitment or retention, or in building a stronger education system, or making our state revenue structure more solid and reliable and balanced. No, Metro's responsibility for job growth is in the areas of land supply and transportation infrastructure, making land ready for jobs. My opponent and I also understand how Oregon's land use laws work. We know that every 5 years, Metro is required to provide land for 20 years' growth. The law gives Metro a choice in how to provide that land supply. It must either expand the region's urban growth boundary, or it can do the hard work with its local government partners to adopt new strategies to make it more likely the existing supply of land within the urban growth boundary can handle that growth. I've made it clear what I'm going to do. I'll work hard to protect taxpayers' investments in our communities and to protect farmland, forests, and water quality in the countryside by finding ways to redevelop old strip malls into bustling, thriving main streets, to clean up contaminated sites and remove other barriers to using our existing land supply for jobs, and to spend infrastructure dollars in our communities instead of in farm fields, so that 20 years from now, our neighborhoods will be more convenient, more vibrant, and more livable, and our countryside will look the same as it does today. My opponent's also been clear about his intentions. As mayor of Hillsboro, he tried again and again to expand the urban growth boundary and fought with Metro when it said no. He knows that if Metro doesn't do the hard work to accommodate growth inside the boundary, Metro will be required to expand the boundary onto farmland. The development interests supporting my opponent know this as well, and they're betting he'll let that sprawl happen. This election isn't about which candidate supports job growth and economic recovery. We both do. This election is about picking the candidate who will work for economic recovery while protecting the future our children and grandchildren inherit. That is the work I want to do, and I ask for your help. Thank you very much.
This wraps up today's City Club Friday Forum. As the President returns to the stage, I'd like the audience to give a big round of applause to both of these fine candidates.
I'd also like to thank our Truth Squad members, Joyce DeMonin, Jean Hart, and Jennifer Rollins. Thank you also to our timekeeper, Tony Iacarino, and a special thank you to our moderator, Paul Gronke. And of course, our greatest appreciation goes to our debaters, Tom Hughes and Bob Stacey. Please join us again next week for a single chair debate with gubernatorial candidate John Kitzhaber. We are adjourned.